So, because California's on fire, I took a small road trip out to Colorado, and I figured with all this nature, it'll be a good idea to talk about China and their environmental miracle after their rapid economic development. Comparing China's rate of reducing pollution and climate change and CO2 emissions with the West, we can finally determine how sincere Western critique is when pointing the finger about global warming. Stay tuned, comrades. Should be a good one. If there's one thing the West loves to pick on, it's China and their pollution. There's no denying the amount of CO2 emissions, pollution, and smog the country experiences. But I think it's fair to say that it's not 2008 anymore. It's important to note, while China is experiencing vast economic and productive development, it's the first country in history to have that rapidly coincide with environmental protections. Now, as we observe history, the environment has always taken a back seat when it came to economic growth, especially during the industrial revolutions the West has experienced.
And they made enormous profits in their industrial centers. But while the Industrial Revolution brought wealth to some and jobs for others, it came with a price tag. Pollution from coal-powered factories turned the cities black.
The West was able to generate incredible amounts of wealth, unequal, mind you, while polluting dozens of major cities and sources of water, food, and air. The Industrial Revolution in the UK started in 1760, one of the first of its kind. The first environmental laws that dealt with the problems such as sewage, housing, and town planning, and even atmospheric emissions commenced in 1863. But it wasn't until a century later more intensive environmental laws were put in place. In the US, our Industrial Revolution was in 1790. The first environmental statute was the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, over a century later, and it's been largely superseded by the Clean Water Act. However, most of the current environmental statutes were passed in the time spanning the late 1960s to the early 1980s. But from what I can see when researching this topic, many sources say China did not start its industrialization until the 1980s after Deng Xiaoping's opening up policy. Many didn't even call this a revolution because I guess, they already had that. Am I right? But before we even get into the charts, I really want to point out the hypocrisy that the West has with pollution from China, without even considering their own position when they were industrializing. Countries must increase their economic growth and productivity to produce for their people. But socialism, especially with Chinese characteristics, has shown the incredible ability to enact swift environmental action to combat emissions that complement their economic development. Their efforts now are more intensive measures that mimic the West, but it only took mere decades instead of centuries, thanks to their centralized socialist government. In fact, Xi Jinping thought has enshrined ecological civilization as a party's ultimate goal, with many measures enacted in pursuit of it.
For China, establishing an ecological civilization is a fundamental strategy in achieving sustainable development.
既要金山银山，又要绿水青山，宁可要绿水青山，不要金山银山，因为绿水青山就是金山银山。
Mind you, in the West, we have several major conservative and reactionary political parties, some of which are already in power, that deny environmental protectionism in its entirety.
And we're seeing this warming trend make our summers warmer, but also our winters warmer as well. But I think we want to work with you to really recognize the changing climate and what it means to our forests, and actually work together with that science.
It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Well, I don't think science knows, actually. Tom?
Researching this area, we were astounded by the amount of statistics, historical, ideological, and overall achievements China has made when cutting pollution and supporting efforts in stopping global warming. We can spend hours on just one area of these great achievements, but the point of this video is to show the following. It's easy just to point at the statistics and blame a country for being the biggest polluter on Earth while ignoring their efforts to improve their environment. Trump is probably the biggest hypocrite of this to excuse his own stripping of Americans' environmental protections.
It's a war that the American president is fighting alone. He has attacked India, China and Russia, this time over climate change. Donald Trump says these countries do not fulfill their responsibilities towards the environment, blaming these nations for not doing enough. He said, and I'm quoting, China, India, Russia, many other nations, they do not have very good air, not very good water, and a sense of pollution and cleanliness. Not just that, Trump patted himself on the back for a job well done, claiming that the US was among the most environment-friendly nations in the world. That's not surprising given that Donald Trump and facts usually do not get along. When it comes to carbon dioxide emissions, the US remains one of the top defaulters in the world. A report released by the Rhodium Group in January this year found that US carbon dioxide emissions rose by 3.4% in 2018. The increase was the highest in 8 years.
As Yale University economist Stephen S. Roach puts it, by changing its economic model, shifting its sources of fuel, developing new transportation systems, and embracing eco-friendly urbanization, China's sustainability strategy is an example of global leadership that the rest of the world should consider very carefully. In the rush to demonize China over trade, the West has missed the point altogether. In the past 12 years, China's economic structure has shifted dramatically from excessive reliance on smokestack manufacturing industries to low-carbon services. So after explaining the reasons for their pollution, I want to highlight 3 areas where China has exceeded in environmental protection. Okay, we have like a family deer down there that I had no idea would be crossing the street. I was not expecting this. So after explaining the reasons for their pollution, carbon emissions, and whatnot, I want to highlight 3 areas where China has excelled in environmental protection. First, CO2 reduction. Second, reforestation. And third, sustainable energy. Now, it's well known that China is the largest carbon emitter, but we really need to look at the stats in a more comprehensive manner in order to understand the fuller picture. If you rank countries by CO2 per capita emissions from domestic consumption, guess who's number 1? It's the United States, and China only uses a third of what the US does. The term world largest polluter is a loaded phrase seeking to blame China because it fails to understand that it's also the world's most populous country. People act like if China loses their factories, CO2 emissions would just disappear. No, it would just move somewhere else. The United States emits half of the amount of CO2 that China does, with 1/4 of its population. This is a huge problem and lever that no one ever mentions for some odd reason. Neither what the US failed to do, especially from withdrawing from essential treaties to lower carbon emissions. And it also fails to talk about how China is actually meeting and exceeding these deadlines when it comes to carbon talks. China's leadership is dedicated to working with international institutions in good faith to reduce their carbon emissions.
The Paris Agreement against the climate change shows us the big direction for the green and low carbon transition and marks the minimum action needed for the protection of the Earth. We will reach the peaking of CO2 emission before 2030 and reach carbon neutrality before 2060.
While the second biggest polluter is still denying climate change as a whole. This is what I call bad faith finger pointing. With all these achievements China has under its belt in just carbon emissions alone, along with a dedicated president and Communist Party working with environmentalists while growing their economy, the West decides to blame China. Instead of helping and mirroring their effort, they are impeding these efforts, both domestically and abroad, in their own countries and in China as well. It not only hurts us, but it also distracts from the harms that we are doing by not focusing on how to fix them. And Mother Earth has only gotten greener thanks to China's efforts, especially when we get into reforestation. Remember that YouTuber, Mr. Beast, that wanted to plant 20 million trees and raised a bunch of money and got a lot of publicity because of doing so? And then I don't know what happened after. This was probably the most popular reforestation effort happening in the West. 20 million trees. China has planted 66 billion trees. 66 billion since 1978. China's largest tree planting drive, the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, also called the Great Green Wall, is designed to halt desert encroachment into many of the countryside areas. The government has said that it has planted more than 66 billion trees across 13 provinces in the country since 1978. Around the year 2000, deserts across the country were expanding more than 10,000 square kilometers a year. But in 2017, the State Forestry Administration reported that China's deserts were shrinking by more than 2,400 square kilometers a year.
These changes occur so quickly that it's often hard to find them on the latest maps. This is a forest near Ordo City, northwest China, in the middle of what many maps still label as a desert. The Maosu, China's 5th largest desert, the size of Massachusetts and Connecticut combined, is now about 80% afforested.
未治理之前，已经霍洛奇的森林覆盖率不足3%，在治理以后，植被覆盖度90%以上。
Oh, and remember when China sent 60,000 PLA military soldiers to plant trees? And they promised between 2020 and 2035, China plans to further boost their percentage of forest coverage to 26% of the entire country. More than a quarter of China will be forests from lands that were mostly deserts. China is well known for making forests out of deserts, as they have several dedicated leaders taking charge of this effort. I'm always inspired by these kinds of reforestation efforts. It reminds me of Thomas Sankara, who helped plant 10 million trees during his tenure as president of Burkina Faso. Marxist-Leninists really do know how to provide ecological health when they need to combat pollution and desertification. Now we come to sustainable energy. Coal is the largest burning fuel, but it also pushed China to become a leader in renewable energy.
It's the world's first solar farm bearing the image of a panda built in Datong, Shanxi province. Datong, once known as China's capital of coal, ranked 3rd on the country's worst air pollution list in 2005. Now, the city is leading in green energy growth.
自从熊猫电站建设成为以后呢，行业内的新能源也不断地涌入了大同。
Because of China's dedication to renewable energy, they have accomplished many of humanity's firsts, from having the world's largest wind farm, the largest hydroelectric dam, which has been a target for a lot of propaganda.
We have a problem.
Oh, hi, Marco. What is it?
The Three Gorges Dam, it's going to collapse.
Really? Again?
Yeah, it's what the Taiwanese media says.
Shout out to Guan Video Global and his video on the truth about the Three Gorges Dam, dispelling a lot of Western propaganda about how it's going to break and how it's going to fail. Largest thermal power plant, energy transmission network, the 4th largest solar park in the world, and having the largest deep sea operations platform in the world, for which China has become the first country to mine fire ice, which is methane hydrate that can be used for energy. China is continuing to grow with incredible accomplishments and becoming world firsts for humankind. Its ecological preservation and protection while growing its economy. It's probably the first to ever demonstrate that economic growth may not necessitate pollution, and all human beings and all political leaders around the world should push for these efforts. It's also incredible to note how China has justified these ecological efforts through Marxism and communistic ideology. To even see Xi Jinping thought and socialism with Chinese characteristics incorporate ecological civilization to their constitution, books, and overall ideology shows a sincere dedication in preserving the environment.
In a nutshell, there are 3 theoretical sources of an ecological civilization. First, it is a Marxist ecology. Marx once said that a harmonious development between man and nature depends on transformed relations between man and man. and man and society. That is to say, having a harmonious development between man and nature depends on our mode of production in life.
You know, like I said before, comrades, I couldn't hike in California because of the fires that were happening there. My skies turned orange because of climate change. And although we do love our giants, it's not the color that we want to see throughout the day. When we have one country putting its best people and tech to resolve this issue, while other countries, mainly my own, deny climate change in ever existing in the first place, it really does put things in perspective on who's really projecting blame here. But enough about blame, comrades. Our planet is crying for better measures and efforts, and it's not going to be done by an idealistic Green Deal. We need something more from our government in order to push something better. China is leading the way, and we should not only follow them, but also forge a new path in competing and becoming better in saving our planet. We need to work together on this. And despite its admissions, China is becoming a leader in environmental protectionism, and countries should pick up the mantle to ensure the longevity of our planet, because we only have one.